When it comes to streamer fishing, if there's one piece of equipment that I have to make sure is exactly right, it's fly line. And so many times, the right fly line means more to me than even picking the right fly. So in this episode of Streamer Tactics, we're going to do a deep dive on fly line. In all seriousness, fly lines come in two different kinds. Those that float and those that sink. First, let's talk about floating lines. Floating lines are just that. They float. But if you're fishing a smaller river or smaller creek with maybe a heavier fly, maybe short shots with a fast sinking fly, this is an option. Now, when we're talking about sinking flies or heavier flies, we're talking about flies like Strollus's headbanger or a fish skull double deceiver, stuff like that. Flies that are obviously meant to get to the bottom. Now, when it comes to sinking lines, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page of how these fly lines are rated. For the most part, we buy sinking fly line that's based off of grain weight to match the fly rod we're going to be using. That grain weight has nothing to do with how fast that fly line will sink. Nothing. Fly lines are rated by how much the first 30 feet of the fly line weighs. A 5-weight fly line weighs so much, 6-weight, 7-weight, and so on. Again, this has nothing to do with how fast the fly line will sink. When someone comes to streamer fish with me and we're talking gear, one of the first questions I ask is what is the sink rate of your fly line? Inevitably, I get a lot of, I have a 275 grain line, or I have a 325 grain line. And that's great and grand, but that doesn't tell you how fast it's going to sink. To prove this point a little better, you can have a 900 grain fly line that floats, but you could have a 10 grain fly line that sinks. These are extremes, but you follow. For the most part, I think this is mostly the manufacturer's fault. You see, whenever integrated sink tips really first kind of came to be, they were grain weight rated, and they didn't have a lot of sink rate options. It was either floating, intermediate, or sinking. But once you get into the sinking portion of fly line, that's where you really need more options than any of the others. So if you have a 275 grain fly line that has a 3 inch per second sink rate, you know that fly line is going to sink about 3 inches per second. If you have a 275 grain fly line that's a 6 inch per second line, then you know it's going to sink about 6 inches, and so on and so forth. This is the only way to know how fast your fly line will sink, is to know the inches per second that it will sink at. Some manufacturers will have a T rating, a T3, a T6, a T9, and so on and so forth. Some manufacturers will have an inches per second rating, which is a IPS rating. 3 IPS, 6 IPS, 9 IPS, so on. But mark my words, the only way you will know how fast your fly line sinks is by that T rating or the inches per second. Period. So when the manufacturers make a sinking fly line, they basically rate them by dropping them in a pool and measuring how fast they sink. So don't go to your local river with a T6, a stopwatch, and a ruler and expect it to sink at exactly 6 inches per second in moving water. It's not going to happen. So think of these ratings as a general idea of how fast a fly line will sink. A T3 will sink half as fast as a T6, and so on. This is the easiest way to figure out what fly line you need. Some of the flies you'll use with a sinking line are the pretty much weightless flies, like the swim flies, like my knucklehead, like the double deceiver, and flies like that. These flies need help getting to the depth of the water that we want to fish them at. But if you want to fish a knucklehead in a river that's fast moving and deeper running, definitely going to need help getting it down. So a T3 or a T6 is where I'm going to lean pretty hard. But still, if you're going to fish a fly even like a double deceiver on a medium-sized river that runs pretty fast, I'm still going to lean T3 and maybe even a T6. And going back to my intro and why fly lines mean more to me than the fly choice so much is I need to be able to cover the water that I need to cover right now. I need to do it, and I need to be able to do that. So if I don't have the right fly line, I don't have the ability to get any fly to the depth that I want to fish it. And that's an immediate deal breaker. So just to make it clear, we are not talking about those loop-to-loop connection, horrible sinking additions that you add on the end of a fly line. If you're still fishing those, I'm so sorry. In this day and age, integrated sink tips are the only way to go. They make it a pleasure to cast a sinking line. These integrated sinking lines are so easy to cast that I've gotten to the point whenever I start to cast a floating line, it's not as easy for me to cast because I don't have that help, that cheated weight on the end of the fly line. So yeah, I have to kind of tweak my stuff, but integrated sink tips are the only way to go. Now, having said that, I do need to say that if you're going to fish more than one line, you have to have more than one line. I personally carry 3 lines all the time. I have a T3, a T6, and a T9 in my boat all the time. So that does mean buying 3 different fly lines. Now, I'm not saying that everybody needs 3 different fly lines, but I will say that most of the time, even on your home local river that you know better than any river, water levels will fluctuate. And if you're fishing a T3 when you really need a T6, you're hurting yourself. So the length of the sinking portion of the fly line means as much as the weight of the sinking portion of the fly line. Meaning, if you're fishing a big river where you're going to make a 60, 70 foot cast and the only sinking portion of the fly line is 10 feet long, then your fly never gets to the zone that you really want it in because the floating or the intermediate section is constantly dragging that short 10 foot section up to the surface. But if you have a 30 foot section of that same sinking fly line, it's down there longer. It's down there 20 feet longer and lasts way longer at that depth. So my advice is always have a longer sinking section than you think you really need. But if you're only going to fish short shots at the bank and stuff like that, and you're never going to cast, 40 feet or more than that, then yeah, you can get away with a shorter section of fly line. But if there's a chance where you need to cover a lot of water at any given point, get a longer fly line, call it good, because you've always got it. So last and probably least of the sinking lines is a full sinking line. I personally despise full sinking lines, but I see their point in a lake setting. Like, if you're gonna fish a full sinking line, only fish in a lake from a boat. That's the only thing that makes any sense to me. A full sinking line is the whole line sinks at the same depth at the same speed. And in a lake setting, it works. It works pretty well. But in a river setting, it's a little different. You see, especially if you're wading, you're gonna be stripping line in, and that line will sink as soon as you strip it in at your feet the whole time. So it gets tangled around your feet. It's god-awful. It's horrible. So for most river settings, a full sinking line is probably more of a pain than it is really a help. So my personal recommendation on a fly line for medium to large rivers, which is my cup of tea, is a line that's pretty near and dear to my heart. And you can probably tell that I'm a Cortland guy, and I helped them come up with the compact series of fly lines. The compact series comes in floating, intermediate, T3, T6, and T9. The sinking portion of this line is a 28-foot sinking portion with a 12-foot step. So it's got the 28-foot sinking portion with a 12-foot intermediate step, and then it goes up into the running line. And I love this line. It's absolutely bulletproof. It doesn't coil real bad. It's just got that Cortland bulletproofness. You're not going to go through it in a season. You're going to have it for a few seasons. It's good line. It really, really is. If they didn't make this line to fix exact problems that I had with other lines, then there's no way I would be even talking about this right now. This line fixes the problems that I kept running into with other manufacturers, which was the coiling and the just not lasting. So it does both. It has low memory, which means you just pull the coil out once and you're done, you're fishing all day. And it's bulletproof. It lasts forever, just like the good old Cortland lines just always do. So I didn't want to get into too much of a commercial with this, but I have been getting a lot of questions over the years about what fly line I use specifically. And my go-to is I use the Cortland Compact Sink T3, T6, and T9. I will always have all three in my boat on me all the time. And there's never been a point at any given time where I didn't feel like that I was covered on fly line. So, yeah. So the natural progression into streamer tactics, the next episode is going to be leaders. We're going to cover leader length from short to long and the differences in what they will do. And we're also going to cover the knots that it takes to build those leaders all the way down to the knot to tie the fly on.